Up. If you don't know me, my name is Mary Collins, and this is my presentation to receive a graduate degree in conservation leadership. And here on the title slide, you see a group of organizations who I worked with throughout the summer and fall in conducting the Capstone project. So let's get started. Let me click. So before I jump into the content, let's talk about the agenda for today. We're going to start out really broadly and talk about the ocean and what's going on currently and what's gone on in the past with marine connectivity conservation. Then we'll jump into the challenges and associated opportunities with producing guidelines for practicing connectivity conservation within marine and coastal spaces. And then we'll jump into current policy that is arising, incorporating marine connectivity into language. And then we'll get to the meat of the presentation today, the conversation, and that is the deliverables that we were able to produce this summer and fall. And those appear in a document that was published in September called the Rules of Thumb for MPA and MPA Network Design. And as a reminder to everybody, an MPA is a marine protected area. And then we'll dive into a couple case studies that were written and specifically highlight how those rules of thumb are being applied in practice globally in marine and in coastal systems. And then we'll go through a survey that I created and sent out to marine protected area managers and scientists and practitioners, also on a global scale, to get feedback on the rules of thumb that we developed, but also to gain information about topics that we just don't know much about currently and identified as gaps in knowledge. Finally, we'll wrap up this conversation today with lessons learned and recommendations for next steps. So the ocean, we're starting broad, right? It covers 70% of our Earth. It's extremely important for the functioning of both marine and terrestrial systems. It produces over 50% of the global oxygen, and it also absorbs about 25% of the global carbon emissions that we produce. It also regulates the Earth's climate with heat transport through currents that take water from warmer climates up to colder climates. And it also feeds over 3 billion people globally and contributes 1.5 trillion annually to the global economy. And all that being said, the ocean is extremely rich in biodiversity, but there's still so much to still be discovered about ocean environments. And that brings us to connectivity. Connectivity is an extremely important and defining characteristic of allowing these systems in oceans to function as they do and provide us with the oxygen and the carbon sequestration. And in that sense, marine connectivity includes ecological perspectives as well as process-based systems. And you can't work in a field that includes connecting ecosystems without connecting people as well. So marine connectivity is also social. And in that respect, marine connectivity conservation exists within planning and management, both planning and management of area-based conservation efforts. So connectivity is actually a design criteria set by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. And you can see here that it is extremely underused in the past in the planning of marine protected areas, MPAs. And this paper that came out in 2019, you can see at the bottom, connectivity was the second to last used design criteria in planning. And most of that came from Australia and California in the United States. So that provides an opportunity to see what connectivity can do in marine spaces to help protection. So if you don't walk away with anything else today from this talk, I want you to walk away with this, and that is that connectivity conservation is a scalable tool, and it can be used to address many of the common obstacles faced in marine systems, governance, and management. It exists, and we can make use of it. So why marine connectivity? We've talked a little bit about how it's absolutely essential to system functioning in the marine environment and ocean. And it also boosts resilience to disturbance, like climate change and fishery depletions. And it also increases collaboration. If you approach conservation with a connectivity lens, that means you're going to be talking to the stakeholders that exist in different locations to work across boundaries to find solutions. Marine connectivity, by supporting these essential ocean functions, also supports the economic benefits that we receive from the ocean. And here's a quick visual of how that works. The functional and structural components of oceans and coasts contribute to producing ecosystem services that have goods and services and cultural benefits that we all relate to in some way. You know, shipping even. I bet everything, or at least one piece of the clothing you're wearing today, was shipped overseas to you. And these ecosystem services produce the goods and services that we can sell, but also promote human well-being, which in turn loops back into demand for the ecosystem services, continuing throughout generations and providing those values. So connectivity conservation, it started in terrestrial environments primarily. And if you're familiar with conservation tactics, you've probably seen this done before. In terrestrial environments, you mainly think about corridors of trees that connect wider landscapes that animals use to transport through the landscape. Or you think of stepping stone environments for species like migratory birds to stop along their flight pathway. And these considerations, while also true for marine environments, have to shift a bit when we're considering it for a completely different system that includes a three-dimensional space and a fluid environment to a larger extent than terrestrial systems. So before we go any further, we should pause and look at some definitions. This is kind of a new field, and it's important to really understand how people are defining ecological connectivity within conservation and in general. So ecological connectivity is defined as the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. Now, a lot of organizations who are focusing primarily on migratory species use this definition, and the ecological connectivity for species is the definition that I chose to use and my partners chose to use within all of the work we conducted this summer and fall. And that is because it includes both the functional movement of the species, but also the structural connection of non-living things within the environment, which the species so much depend on. And so in that respect, connectivity includes both. And then connectivity conservation is putting that into practice within conservation and restoration. So marine connectivity conservation has some increasing international pressures, especially in establishing greater and wider ranges of protected areas. And that is manifested in the compounded and increasing effects of climate change and how that's affecting local livelihoods and communities. It also is showing up in the pressures for carbon sequestration, for which marine systems can sequester vast amounts. You know, mangrove forests can sequester up to 10 times the amount as terrestrial forests. So there's huge implications for whether those systems are being protected or demolished as populations grow. There's also increasing financial pressures from funder nations put on these sometimes smaller and sometimes developing countries. And we've seen that come into play in debt for nature swaps. For example, in the Seychelles, that has happened where richer countries pay off a lot of the debt in turn, the smaller countries preserve large portions of their land or water. And recently it was announced that Belize will be going through a similar process. There's also conditional development funds that puts pressure on small countries to preserve a lot of ecosystem services, including marine environments. Also, there's increasing pressure from the SWIFT designation, spearheaded by collaborative international targets like protecting 30% of the Earth's environments by 2030. And finally, talking about international targets, there's pressure to do better. The targets set for 2020 in called the Aichi targets by CBD, but none of them were met, not one. And I think there is a lot of potential to gain support for really trying to set targets that are achievable now because of that large failure in the past. And it's important to note that Aichi Target 11, which was to protect 10% of the marine environments, while it was not met, it was one of the most successful targets out of the collection. So we've done a brief overview of what marine connectivity is, the pressures that are facing countries internationally to protect more area. And now we'll dive into a little bit of the challenges and opportunities, which kind of go hand in hand within this field. So here we go. And I touched on this briefly before, but like terrestrial connectivity, marine connectivity occurs in a complex social ecological system, but the aspects that govern this system are entirely different. So let's go through some of the specifics that makes marine connectivity so different from terrestrial connectivity. So we're in a three-dimensional space. We have to take into account connectivity going up to the side, all directions. And marine connectivity also includes land to sea interactions. So we're not just talking about water, we're also talking about the land to sea interface as well. In marine systems, there's high environmental variability, and this occurs in water chemistry, turbidity, mixing, depth, light, and all of these factors play huge roles in determining who can live where in the marine environment. These species can be extremely dependent on these characteristics, and they change dramatically throughout the ocean. And we also, of course, have climate change, and climate change affects marine systems in a different way than it affects terrestrial systems. So the changes we see in connectivity conservation may be different. And finally, there are knowledge gaps. In terms of data and knowledge in marine systems, we do know that there are gaps, and we have to conduct this conservation and produce guidelines in a sphere where we have to accept that we don't know everything, and maybe start to pave ways to start to know more. So another challenge that we have for marine connectivity conservation is that there's no unifying ocean governance mechanism in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and we call these ABNJ. You can see here on this map that all of this blue space is ABNJ, and it accounts for 74% of the ocean. And this is a challenge because if there's not one governance mechanism, there's not one way that we can effectively protect this ocean environment that is not just empty space, it's live and vital and fluid and supports so much carbon sequestration and so much species movement that we rely on. And to get a better picture of how stratified these governance structures is the high sea, I wanted to include this little constellation for you. And this shows all of the marine agreements currently in the high seas, with those on the left of the screen, including those primarily concerned with conservation. And those on the right of the screen are those agreements that are primarily concerned with human extraction of marine species and resources. So sometimes this hits a sort of a conflict of interest when they're the ones in charge of also protecting the space that they're charged with extracting and using. There's also technology increases, and that increasing in use and extraction of the marine environment comes with increases in technology. So that's also a challenge we face internationally with connecting these systems. So we're seeing this increasing need expressed in policy. And I'll touch on just a few here for you. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and its drafted framework that came out recently included well-connected systems as one of its primary goals. And the 2021 UN resolution called Nature Knows No Borders is extremely important for connectivity conservation because it explicitly says people need to cooperate across boundaries. You know, ecosystems don't respect those boundaries. We need to cooperate. And then the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species has several resolutions that speak to connectivity in general, but the improving ways of addressing connectivity is what I believe to be the most relevant. And finally, what I find to be the most exciting is this upcoming high seas treaty renewal under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. And what this is a, this would be an agreement that would bring all of those high seas governance structures together under a body that has a framework for protection. If this passes, we'll have a way to protect these high seas. And currently in the within the proposal, connectivity is included as a criteria for designating these new types of protected areas. So far we've gone through the importance of marine connectivity, what it is, why is it important, and the increasing need seen through policy and pressures. So now we're going to talk about the solution, and this is what my capstone project was, and it was systematically incorporating connectivity conservation into MPA and OACM planning and management. And OACM are other effective areas for conservation management that don't necessarily fall into the official marine protected area designation. So I worked with a group called the Marine Connectivity Working Group to do this. And this is their primary goal, is to connect critical habitats, facilitate species movement, and to sustain the biodiversity of marine systems. And they were only assembled in 2019 and now have over 90 members within their working group, all of which are marine protected area professionals, managers, scientists, and also just generally marine related scientists who have an interest or a specialty within connectivity. And the members range from 20 plus countries. So a couple of the key objectives that the Marine Connectivity Working Group works in include science. We have to know how to measure connectivity, and this is an ongoing process. And we also work on planning, producing, the rules of thumb and guidelines to help marine protected area managers and other planners to know how to effectively use connectivity within their protected spaces. And also we work in governance and participation. We interact with the policymakers to make sure that they know that connectivity exists and is important, and they can include it if they see fit. And finally, we work in communication, technical outreach, and support for those people who are on the ground doing the management in marine and coastal systems. And the structure of the Marine Connectivity Working Group is a little complex, so I wanted to include this lovely little constellation for you. And so the Marine Connectivity Working Group exists within the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, which is hosted by the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, but was produced by the World Commission on Protected Areas, which functions under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So that is the structure, and Moat Marine Laboratories is the Marine Connectivity Working Group's primary partner who works with us in all projects. Now, there are multiple other partners we work with, but those are project specific. One who's notable is the NOAA Center for Marine Protected Areas. They work with us on specific projects. So within this group and within this framework, we were able to produce marine connectivity conservation rules of thumb for MPA networks and MPAs. And we were able to publish this in September for use by MPA managers as a checklist to make sure that they can put in place the actions necessary to produce a connected system. It was also published to inform the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as it was being developed and continues to be developed. And this document was produced through a literature review, but also an online consultation on an advanced draft. And I will go into a little bit of detail about that online consultation. So we sent this consultation out as a survey that included the full drafted text of the rules of thumb. And we got feedback from the specialist group from a bunch of different countries, including Australia, Puerto Rico, Kenya, Norway, United States, United Kingdom, China, and New Zealand, giving feedback on these rules of thumb and how we can make them better, what we should leave out. And within their recommendations, I was able to bring all of them together and build a little code book that helped us make decisions for both identifying gaps in knowledge for future research, as well as topics to include or adjust within the draft. So with that, we were able to produce 13 rules of thumb to effectively guide marine connectivity conservation within place-based protections. And I wanted to show you what they look like. We're not going to read through every single one of them. You can do that on your own. And I want to note also that we chose not to include subtitles for each because we truly want each person who's accessing this document and making use of it to consider the full rule of thumb, not just the key words that we would include as titles. So with that caveat, we're going to look at subtitles that I made for each and every one of them. So the first and foremost, most important rule of thumb of all is that ecological connectivity should always be considered in the design of an MPA or an MPA network using best available science. And there's many more to go through. A couple noteworthy ones is that species larval dispersal can be measured and can be used in designing effective protections, because if you know the distance that a specific larvae travels, you can then protect that settling environment for the juveniles to grow up in a safe and protected space, often providing increased fisheries for the fishermen. We talked a bit about source to sea. We also included a rule of thumb for anticipating climate change impacts, which includes buffer zones. And we also included a rule of thumb about deep sea assessments. You know, we don't know a lot about these environments, but we can take the little amount of information that we do have and construct management plans to inform how to move forward with these environments. Cross-jurisdiction cooperation is also a rule of thumb, and as well as habitat suitability modeling and predictive modeling. This is extremely important for moving forward and putting in place effective protections, because we really can't gauge what protections will work if we're not looking to future changes in the environment. You know, we can't scale protection on what's happened in the past for the most part. So all of these rules of thumb were then expanded on in a series of case studies that I was able to write up. And I wrote 15 case studies that represent 31 countries internationally. And I was lucky enough to be able to incorporate them on this great website called Globescapes. And that's hosted through the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. And you can see here in this map, the blue identifiers are all of the marine connectivity case studies that exemplify 2 to 4 of the rules of thumb in each. And the green ones are case studies that exemplify terrestrial corridor connectivity. So I'll talk about 2 of what I believe to be very interesting case studies that's part of this collection. The Belize Maya Mountain Marine Corridor is a fascinating network of protected areas that has been protected in Belize, that incorporates a marine protected area that spans a wide coastal range. And also the management tactics include the land-based pollution sources. And also, so that brings in a multi-management and source to sea considerations, which is rule of thumb 7. A really interesting part about this case study is that the government recognized that they couldn't manage and really look after all of these protected areas the way they wanted to. They didn't have the capacity, so they gave it back to the local and indigenous communities, giving them the agency to really monitor and make the practices that they believe to be culturally appropriate, but also beneficial to the environment in whole. And that has manifested primarily in cacao plantations on land, which grow under the overstory. So instead of vast amounts of like cattle in these environments, it's now being transformed into forested landscapes that are producing good livelihoods for the people who work there, and they've spurred these efforts. Another interesting case that I wanted to highlight is in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, and this covers a little broader scope of international cooperation, because we're working here with 4 different countries, coastal countries. And they've all come together to work together and try to protect these valuable ecosystems that the species really connect these countries to a huge degree. And the management units within that protection has been able to do so scaled to the swimways that tagged species have shown are extremely important. One being the Cocos and Galapagos swimway, which there has been a lot of news in the past week about, because new protections were announced that that protects at least half of the swimway thus far. And an additional announcement came out that all 4 countries will be protecting this entire seascape in a marine protected area to help combat illegal fishing, primarily coming from China across the ocean. So there'll be much more information to come, but rule of thumb 10 and 5 were most prominent for this specific case. And with all of that said, I do want to remind you that connectivity conservation is not a panacea, and it really does require a nuanced understanding of the systems and the people and the animals that exist in these environments. And we can talk about connectivity and how it can be applied in so many cases, but it's not a blanket. You still really have to take into consideration all of the intricacies at play. So with that, I wanted to capture some of those intricacies. And to do that, we created a survey that targeted responses from MPA managers through the networks that connect them. And that included managers, practitioners, and scientists for MPAs. And we were able to send this survey to 8 different networks internationally and receive feedback from 39 participants. And it was voluntary for all, and the information is confidential, but there was one really key limiting factor, and that was that it was dispersed in English and no other languages. And so the survey focused on 2 primary areas. One is getting feedback on the newly published rules of thumb that we had just put out there in the world. We only got so much feedback from the working group when we were creating these rules of thumb, but we wanted more. We wanted to know the level of confidence each marine protected area manager and scientist had in each and every rule of thumb. We also wanted to know the barriers that existed that they thought would be keeping them from putting each rule of thumb into play. We also wanted to know whether or not they had used anything like this rule of thumb before in management or planning. We also wanted to gain knowledge where we had identified knowledge gaps. And we did that in asking for current trends in marine connectivity conservation, as well as asking about the preferred methods for measuring connectivity. We really don't know too much about how to effectively measure in a way that's accessible internationally for marine protected area managers. So we wanted to gain more information about that. We also wanted to know, where are they getting funding for any of these activities? Because that could help inform future guidance that we give. So a couple of key findings that we collected was that there's huge increases in marine connectivity use. The one metric that we had, and I showed in the beginning of this conversation, was that only 11% of marine protected area planners were making use of connectivity within their plans. And it turns out that the results indicate that about 49% of the participants in our survey actually had used before or were currently using the rules of thumb. And we also saw that the rules of thumb were largely applicable in practice. 77% of those participants indicated that they were either confident or somewhat confident that they could take those rules of thumb and put them in place on the ground where they are working currently. On the ocean, that is. Other key findings that we got was that the largest barriers are fixable. Lack of knowledge to implement was the largest barrier identified from these marine protected area managers. And part of our objective with the Marine Connectivity Working Group is to spread knowledge and awareness. So, you know, that's an objective that maybe we can focus a little more on in the future. Lack of funding is also always a struggle for marine protected areas, and insight on funding helps really dive deeper into why that is the case. And that is partly because funding is extremely polarized. You can see that government funds take the primary cake for the funding that all of these marine protected areas are using for restoration and for conservation. So there's opportunity there to diversify funding. Another key challenges that were identified were competing stakeholder interests occurred a lot, as well as gaining political will and support for cross-boundary cooperation. And also collaboration with Indigenous stakeholders. You know, some people find it difficult to collaborate, maybe because lack of trust from past events or for other reasons. So now we have a better understanding of what's going on within the realm of marine connectivity, and we need to set new objectives for the working group. We've produced all of this great material, but you know, we need to reassess. So these are a couple of the next steps that we've identified moving forward. And one is to use the information gathered to date, including the survey data, which is much more detailed than what I just showed you. There's more analysis to be had for each individual rule of thumb, and also to produce a rules of thumb 2.0 that takes into account all of the survey results and feedback and increases in knowledge that we've seen in publications just in the past few months since the publication. We also want to look to produce a roadmap for marine connectivity conservation to look farther into the future and to help governments and people and communities to make that happen. We want to increase in collaboration as well. Within the Marine Connectivity Working Group, you know, we have these 90 amazing members, and they're here to help and to collaborate, and we need to engage them to a larger extent within work going into the future. And we also want to strengthen partnerships with those who we've worked with in the past to put in place and measure whether these rules of thumb are effective on the ground. You know, we want to get some face-to-face interaction, visit these sites, focus on a rule of thumb and see how it goes in practice. We also want to engage the public more. You know, lack of knowledge to implement was one of the largest barriers. So we're actively seeking opportunities to speak and contribute to public events in the future and currently. And we're also continuing to engage in ongoing policy negotiations. And these are very important going forward, especially for the high seas. So to wrap things up today, I want to reflect on the experience of this capstone and working with all of these partners on connectivity conservation. And the first key lesson here is that partnerships are so key. You know, I was extremely lucky to work with multiple partners who could bring such amazing expertise to the table and guidance as I worked through these deliverables. I also want to stress, and I cannot stress enough, that individual outreach goes a very long way. You know, I didn't know any of these groups or individuals before diving into this capstone, and all it took was reaching out for more information. And this also shows up in promoting the rules of thumb. We actually reached out individually to every single CBD and CMS country representative who had a coast to say, these are the rules of thumb, they do exist, they can help in policy within negotiations. And we got really good feedback. And I never thought I would be personally reaching out to these country representatives for the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it happened. And also alignments are beneficial. You know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel when there are existing resources out there to take into account. And also conducting these projects independently provided a lot of professional growth for me, while also facing some challenges. You know, sometimes I wasn't so sure about the decision I was making, and my partners, this is not their primary job. The Marine Connectivity Working Group is just something it's a part of their job, and maybe something they just do on the side. So it was really up to me to help drive these projects forward, and sometimes wait for feedback from my partners and try to decide what else to work on in the meantime. And in that respect, I believe that multiple flexible and ambitious targets were extremely important for the success of this capstone, because there was a lot of waiting periods where my partners were busy, or they couldn't get to reviewing materials or collaborating over ideas for a week or so. And so I had to have multiple targets to be working on at once, so that I could always be moving the ball forward in some respect. And with that, I want to give a huge thank you to my capstone partners, primarily to Erin Lahr with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and also Barbara Laushi with the Marine Policy Institute at Mote Marine Laboratories. The two of them have been absolutely instrumental throughout this entire process, and their expertise are not met probably anywhere. They've been amazing to work with. I also want to thank the CLTL professors for providing a base in the social sciences that I didn't have before coming to the Conservation Leadership Program. And finally, I want to thank my family and friends, my cohort members, for supporting me along the way, and for helping me in this project. So with that, I want to thank you, everybody, and I am very happy to take any questions.
So, Mary, I mean, just absolutely tremendous work. The presentation is wonderful.
Thank you.
I do want to say, just the audience that's on Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the chat, or please raise your hand and I can call on you and help moderate from here. But to kind of get us started off, if you don't mind,
Sure.
I'm really curious on rule of thumb
Yeah.
2.0.
Yes.
When thinking about this one coming out, and then thinking about that the survey only went out in English that first go around, is there any conversations around there being translations or expanding on that at all?
Yeah, there could be in the future, depending on whether capacity is there, and perhaps partnerships to help translate the survey, if we send surveys out, particularly to the working group members. And that also goes into considering, you know, who do we bring into this working group as well, and perhaps diversifying the pool of individuals who are contributing to the expertise, and recognizing that maybe they don't all have to be English speaking, and we can bring in resources for meetings that have active translation, because those exist and we can make use of them. So that is very much in the future, but I believe that it would be very important for diversifying the amount of information we're bringing in.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, just to jump off of that, amazing presentation, by the way. So good. Is the rule of thumb, the document, is that translated into multiple languages?
It is not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have any of these resources translated yet. But that is something that could be on the table in the future, depending on the objectives we set as an organization and capacity. Yeah.
I really liked, yeah, again, amazing job. Definitely, this was a presentation I was like very excited to see because I know how just, yeah, the level of excellence that you bring to like all your work is insane.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
I really like though what you said about setting multiple flexible, ambitious targets. I think that is such a different and refreshing way to look at getting things done. Like it's okay to set really big goals, but like with that kind of adaptive management piece tied in there, which I think is really awesome that you brought that up. And to kind of follow that up, I'm wondering, like, it seems like there's just, yeah, we don't have a lot of time. There's a big sense of urgency with like all these marine issues. Do you think that in this 2.0 version, is there value in setting any kind of time stamps or like benchmarks to reach in a certain, like a time scale format that could help progress some of these, I guess, positive outcomes from these rules of thumb?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And in terms of targets reaching for connectivity, that kind of lies in efforts like the 30 by 30, where the targets exist in the area of protection that's being reached, terrestrial and in marine environments. And also in new targets like the past IT targets that looked for connected ecosystems. And the trick is, in the past, we didn't have a unified, aligned way to measure that connectedness. And what we're looking for in the future is a accessible and aligned way that we can really measure the progress of a well-connected system within marine environments. So those efforts are ongoing, but in essence, the targets don't exist within the rules of thumb. The rules of thumb is a tool that managers and planners can use to help reach those targets effectively. Yeah.
Well, another question that I have is we're also giving space and time for the people in Zoom. I was just curious, in collecting the surveys and speaking with different individuals, did you ever get any maybe surprising pushback about connectivity? Thinking of like only 11% are actually using it.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if there was like, this is not important.
Yeah, no, there definitely is a little bit of pushback, but and that's in a small amount. One individual who gave us feedback as a scientist believes that because the ocean exists in such a fluid system, that targeting connectivity as a management tactic really is not effective. And however, a lot of the recent science that's come out in the past 5 years really contests that, that thought. But there is some pushback because the environments in marine systems are so naturally connected in their functions. However, you know, the forces that are segmenting these habitats are large, and we need to protect connected systems in a way that can keep them functioning. If larvae don't have anywhere to land downstream, they're not going to grow up to be fish that we can then catch and make money off of. Yeah.
So obviously this was very like oceanic focused. Could like a version of this be like transposed or pared down or some way to riparian habitats as well?
For restoration?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another part of connectivity that wasn't necessarily dive deep in for the rules of thumb, because they were particularly focused on area-based protections within marine and coastal environments. And I think restoration in that respect would come into play where connected systems might be lacking certain portions. Let's say you have a specific species that has identified life cycle needs, and maybe mangroves are part of those needs, but there's only a select area of mangroves that population is using. In that sense, by taking connectivity into consideration, you can support the restoration of mangroves along the coastline through the connectivity lens, because it's supporting the movement of these species and the interconnectedness of this system in total.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure the Zoom audience one more time, if there's any questions there.
Oh, another one here.
Last question.
Okay, go for it.
I'm really curious, like, how did you're not gonna like delve into something so hard without a passion, from my perspective. So like, how did you, I guess, find yourself, like, how did this passion grow? Where did this interest come from? And then like, how did you find yourself in a program like CSU, CLTL program, where it's like in a landlocked state? Not a lot of talk about marine out here, but like here you are putting together this, multinational toolkit.
Yeah.
Yeah, how did you get so interested in marine work?
Yeah, good question. And my thought process might not be very straightforward in the answer for that, but my work out of undergrad originated in scientific exploration within marine environments in Panama. And I really enjoyed the work there and the bigger picture of what that research was informing in terms of management practice and policy. But what I lacked was in professional work was that connection between the science and the practice. And so after that, I really wanted to get more involved with the people and conservation on a more international scale. And that's what brought me to corporate conservation practices. And that opened the door to advising corporations on multinational endeavors for protecting nature. And while that primarily did not involve marine systems, I knew that I wanted to come back to marine systems in the end. And in applying to the conservation leadership degree, I knew I wanted to work internationally with people and keep my scientific background. And I found that conservation leadership was the best opportunity for me to learn how to engage different groups of people internationally and locally in conservation efforts, whether they be terrestrial or marine. And that I also, through the program, had the freedom to find a capstone to progress specific interests that I have personally. And that's why I was seeking out marine-related opportunities. So I was really lucky to be able to find this opportunity and kind of get back to my marine origins, but through a program that keeps the door open for other international work that includes terrestrial and marine and social aspects of conservation. Yeah.
I think I have one more question.
Okay.
And I think we might round out.
Go for
here,
it.
okay?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, as you're going through this and just with your background and much more expertise than I have in marine protected areas, but just in some of my readings, I've seen this conversation about, do we do really large scale marine protected areas, or do we do smaller kind of grouped together along those lines? I'm thinking about thinking of the glowscapes.
Yeah.
And how you demonstrated that, seeing both of those existing.
Uh-huh.
I'm just curious if there was anything you came across that really kind of like informs that conversation a little bit more, of thinking about connectivity, thinking about these elements. 'Cause in my mind, I have a thought, but as in just like how I like read it. and think of it.
Right. Yeah.
But as someone that is studying and worked in it, I'd love to hear just a little bit more on your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I think in planning protected areas, there's many approaches that can be taken in designing those spaces, and it varies dramatically from environment to an environment and from country to country, government to government. And, in protecting large spaces of areas, which will probably be happening as we try to reach 30 by 30 and other targets, there are different tactics that can be applied in large protected areas versus smaller protected areas. For example, like bottom trawling, it's a harmful fishing activity that releases carbon from the seafloor and also strips those environments, and it takes a long time for those to come back. So in larger areas, they can perhaps ban specific practices like that, or put a cap on fishing limits, or make fishing seasonal, and really key in on specific management tactics like those. And then also you can have smaller protected area, more stringent areas within those larger spaces as well, which might have more stringent fishing and use regulations. So it's really a constellation and so different for each culture and each government. But it is extremely important, as more and more large areas get protected, to consider the effects that that has on local communities, and to find policies that make the protections effective while allowing economic growth at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate
yeah.
that.
Of course.
All right, well, I think that's gonna round us out here, and I just, again, Mary, tremendous work here.
Thank you. Thank you to all who came online.
Again, thank you for joining us online. I am going to end this presentation, and we will be preparing to transition to the next one. So again, thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, no problem. Sorry I missed the beginning.